Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Many books have been written about the black gangster. They have been, for the most part, lengthy tomes focusing on the kingpins of the gangland scene, gangster with names like Nicky Barnes, Frank Lucas, Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols, and Kenneth Supreme McGiff. Yet there are many stories about the black gangster that have not received much press coverage or have simply been ignored or missed by the media. They indeed reveal a lot about the history of the hood. Straight from the Hood is a compilation of some of those fascinating stories. You will find tales featuring drug kingpins, entertainers, hitmen, street gangs, con men, corrupt cops, and reformed gangbangers. Read about the most feared man in the entertainment industry, the love story between Fran, a former heroin addict, and David, a reformed gangster, both of whom have become celebrities. The unlikely alliance between an ambitious black gangster and a violent, indeed crazy white Italian-American mobster. The terrorist plot involving a Chicago street gang, and more. Learn about Al Capone's impact on Chicago's African-American community and what Alcatraz has to do with Harlem's most famous godfather. Why is Denzel Washington in this book? Who is a modern-day desperado who died by the gun but managed to live on through rap music? How did a stick-up artist from Brooklyn become hip-hop's answer to Lee Harvey Oswald? Each of the following stories are amazing, and all of them are true. The book featured this evening is Straight from the Hood with my special guests, Ron Chepsiuk and Scott Wilson. Welcome back to the program, Ron, and welcome to the program, Scott. And thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you. This is Ron Chepsiuk, and I'm very happy to be back on the program with you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Ron, for appearing, and welcome to the program, Scott Wilson.
Oh, thanks. I'm very happy to be on this program. I'm happy to share this time and talk with you about the book.
Well, great. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have a great program for the folks. Now, I always ask this question because I'm always curious, and I'm sure the audience is a little bit too. Ron, I'll start with you. You've written quite a few books about black organized crime. What made you come to the decision to write this book in particular, short, true organized crime stories, many involving well-known names in hip-hop music? And the second part of that is, what did Scott Wilson bring to this book project, specifically Straight from the Hood?
Well, I decided to do this book because I've been writing, books that deal with really in-depth stories, and I've been collecting a lot of these mini-tales about gangsters in the hood. A lot of these tales don't warrant books in themselves, but were interesting stories, and I thought that they would, serve as a basis for the book. And I've met Scott a couple of years ago. He approached me after reading one of my books, and we developed a friendship and a relationship. And I knew Scott was an excellent writer, and he has his own blog. He's also an expert in hip hop culture, and I knew a lot of these stories, related to the hip hop culture. And I'm not an expert in hip hop culture, although I listen to the music. And so I'm more of an historian. A traditional, type historian, and so I thought that if we put our backgrounds together, we could, come up with a good book, and we did. Scott drew a lot of stories that he had been collecting or heard about, and added them to the book, and then I went through the history and pulled out some interesting stories. Some of them appear in some of my previous books, but a lot of them were original.
Right. Now, what I wanted to ask was, we talked about in the introduction, or at least I had mentioned in the introduction, read about the most feared man in the entertainment industry. Maybe we can start with some of the more important stories. I mean, there's a number of short stories in this book, and all of them are pretty incredible, and a lot of information I had no idea about at all, and a lot of big names. So you threw out a few big names in here. So let's start with why is Denzel Washington in this book, and maybe you can answer that question, Ron.
Everybody always asks that question. That always grabs people's attention on that. Actually, Scott dug this story out, and it's a very interesting story. And Scott could probably talk a little bit about it. Go ahead, Scott.
Okay, well, back in about 2001, I came across a documentary called Welcome to Death Row. It was produced by a friend of mine, a writer by the name of Alan Scott Gordon. He used to be the editor-in-chief at Rap Pages. It was a prominent hip-hop magazine that's now defunct. He also wrote for The Source magazine. He was part of their Mind Squad, what they called the Source Mind Squad back at that time. He produced this documentary along with Lydia Harris, which is Michael Harris's wife. Michael Harris was a prominent cocaine dealer in the LA area in the early 1980s. He was affiliated with a blood set known as the Bounty Hunters. He began to diversify into other areas. Mostly, I think he was really aiming for entertainment, but he began to invest in a lot of legitimate businesses. That seemed to be his goal, to cross over into the legitimate world. He produced a Broadway play called Checkmates. He has the distinction of being the first African American to ever produce a Broadway play. It was Denzel Washington's first ever Broadway play. By that time, Denzel had already had a reputation. He was on St. Elsewhere, the hospital drama St. Elsewhere. So he already came to the table with something of a good resume.
Right. That's very interesting.
And it's interesting about Michael Harris because I had a friend, and he's actually a friend of Michael Harris, and Michael Harris has been in jail since the late 80s, and he just was happening to talk with him on the phone because he called from prison to this mutual friend, and so a mutual friend called me, put us on a three-way, and Harris was sort of grilling me about why was he in our book Straight for the Hood and all that, and I explained it was just a profile, about 1,500 words, and because he was actually doing his own book, and I said this was just a really short story and all that. So it was quite interesting, and he said he was getting out. I think he's probably out of jail now, but this guy had a very promising career as an entrepreneur, an entertainment entrepreneur. And lost it because of a variety of factors. Now,
keeping with this, let's talk about Al Capone's impact on Chicago's African American community, and also what Alcatraz has to do with Harlem's most famous godfather.
Well, Al Capone, I guess you could say he was ahead of his time, and in terms of his relationships with the black community in Chicago, although he wasn't, a raving civil rights advocate, but I think for the time, back in 1920, he was. And of course, Al Capone had come to Chicago about 1919 from New York, and quickly established himself in the rackets. And by the mid 1920s, he was one of the most powerful gangsters in America, and he had a liking for African American music, blues, jazz, etc. And he had a bar, nightclub called Plantation Cafe, and actually in those days it was hard for musicians to get gigs in white-owned clubs, even up in the north, not just the south, and so he sort of allowed a lot of the black musicians to play in his club, and other gangsters would come, and he eventually struck up a relationship with Fats Waller, the famous musician.
Right.
And I have it in my book where Fats Waller one night was summarily picked up by two beefy white gangsters from Al Capone's mob, and taken to this house. And Fats Waller thought it was the end of his days, but actually all there was a birthday party for Capone. And he ended up playing music and staying up late, had champagne for the first time in his life, and went home with he recalled with his pockets bulging and with money. And evidently, Capone worked out a deal with the black community where he stayed out of the numbers, and they bought his booze. So it was an interesting story and a different angle on the Al Capone legend.
Right. And with that as well is, what does Alcatraz itself have to do with Harlem's most famous godfather?
That's Bumpy Johnson, of course, and Scott wrote that story, found it, and I thought it was a very interesting story, and he could probably explain a little bit more about that, give you a little background on Bumpy Johnson. If you've seen the movie Hoodlums, he was in that movie, which was ostensibly depicting 1930s Harlem gangster life, and he was also a big character in American Gangster, the movie that came out in 2007, and he was the gentleman that had a heart attack in the store, and evidently that led to the rise of Frank Lucas, which, of course, as I point out in my book, was a complete lie. We could talk about that later. But Scott wrote the story, and he dug out the information. It's a really interesting story. So maybe Scott can give you some background on the story.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Alcatraz.
Well, yeah, there was Alcatraz, reputedly the escape-proof prison, or so people thought. Bumpy Johnson, among others, I think even Al Capone spent some time there. Bumpy Johnson had spent time there. Now, Bumpy, like Michael Harris, was he was a very intelligent guy. That's why he made it so far in his criminal enterprises. He was a Renaissance man. He was a writer, and I think even a poet. I think he had some of his work published.
Right. He won a poetry contest while he was in prison.
Yes, he won a poetry contest. Supposedly, while he was there, he helped with what is believed to be, I think, the only successful or nearly successful prison break from Alcatraz. He provided a boat for the men who were trying to escape that night. These guys, I mean, they were really detail-oriented. They left, I think, papier-mâché busts of themselves in their beds after they left to simulate someone actually being in the bed in the prison bed asleep. But Bumpy Johnson supposedly made it so that they had a boat waiting on them to sail over to San Francisco. From what I understand, the boat nor the men were ever found. Right. There's no way to know for sure if this prison break was ever successful, and not everyone believes that Bumpy was powerful enough at the time to actually aid in something like that, because with him being in prison, I mean, he wasn't able to be out on the streets making money, and a lot of his savings were probably depleted. But I think even his widow corroborated the story.
Right, and Unsolved Mysteries had a segment on it, right, Scott?
Yes, they did. That's where I think that episode of Unsolved Mysteries has a lot to do with the spreading of that story.
Right, and I was on watching TV the other day, and I was flipping the channels. There was actually a movie made about a prison break from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood, wasn't there?
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
Alcatraz?
Right. Well, it was a breakout from it. Was that the same story?
I'm not sure. I've never actually seen the film, so I can't really answer that.
Yeah. Well, I've never seen the film either, because the film was at a time that I couldn't watch it. But I was thinking about renting it on DVD just to see if there was any connection, or to the story, whether it was based on this story.
Now, another story I found interesting, and hopefully I haven't got this confused. when you talk about the most feared man in the entertainment industry, is this the story about Griffin and Riley, Teddy Riley?
Right. Gene Griffin, I was amazed because in my research, I met a lot of ex-gangsters. A lot of them knew Gene Riley, and he was a legend in the underworld and also in the entertainment industry. He was rumored to be a hitman, drug fiend, and and they knew that if you mess with Teddy Riley, you'd really have some problems on that. And he developed a relationship with Teddy Riley, who became one of the super talents of the music industry, and was reported to be Riley's godfather. And when Riley was starting out, he evidently provided financial support that helped him, even though the two guys, came from a different background. And so I talk about this relationship and how Teddy Riley became, a big name in the industry with the help of Gene Riley. Gene Griffin, excuse me. And but what happened was they got into a contractual disagreement over money, and Riley was suspecting that Griffin was ripping him off, and the figures were reported to be in the millions, and he wasn't making a lot of money, even though he wrote a number of pop hits that became very lucrative.
Right.
Excuse me. On that, and so they ended up splitting, and it didn't really hurt Riley's career. He went on to become even a bigger star, but Griffin's musical career fizzled, and he disappeared as a big name in the music industry, and he died in early 2009 of Alzheimer's.
What I found was interesting about that story too is the amount of you talk about Bobby Brown's huge hit Prerogative, and if people go back a little bit in history, they know how big that tune was. And I found it interesting, and just like you make the conclusion at the end of the story that despite having financial problems and disputes with Griffin, that nothing ever happened to Teddy Riley, and his career went unabated. But what he talked about was that, for example, that Griffin had signed himself on for the royalty that ended up giving him $800,000, where Teddy Riley said there's no way that Griffin had anything to do with writing the song at all.
He claimed to be a co-writer of that song.
Right.
He claimed to be a co-writer of that song. Yeah. He was very shady. And I don't know. You can't make the accusation because he never was, brought to trial for anything wrongdoing.
Right.
But he just had this reputation,
right,
of sort of working in the shadows and not everything being above board. And of course, when you have this type of reputation, a lot of people come to really be wary of you and even fear you. And I guess it's to Riley's credit that it really didn't bother him. In terms of his ambitions, career, he went on to record a whole bunch of songs with Dr. Dre, Queen Pen, and a bunch of other musicians.
To interject, I also want to say that the relationship between Teddy Riley and Gene Griffin is actually pretty common when you look at a lot of the other dynasties in pop music. For instance, the relationship between Suge Knight and Dr. Dre. Dr. Dre was the creative force. He was he's a gifted producer.
Mm-hmm.
He had a new sound at the time, and him and Suge Knight formed Death Row Records, and Suge Knight was kind of the muscle behind the scenes. At first most people didn't know who he was, and I think those relationships proved beneficial for both people at first, because the guy who's the muscle, he's able to make room so that the creative person can do what he does, and they can both make money. But I think eventually the relationship sours because the guy who's the muscle will eventually try to even muscle in on the creative person's territory.
Well, I found it interesting too, and you guys don't talk about it, but for those people that don't know, that the record business has always employed some form of organized crime to be able to get some of these records played, and there's I've read quite a few books about how important some of these guys have been to make or break a record, and when the record companies have back quite a few years ago, one of the record companies decided not to use these guys to be able to get some of the records played, and they showed them how powerful they really were. And we're not talking about chicken feed in terms of money either. We're talking about real serious money for getting this sort of done. So, and in your book, you have numerous stories.
I was just going to say that, Dan, that probably the most famous example is Frank Sinatra, right?
Right.
If he never got a boost from the mob, he might not have made a comeback the way he did.
Sure. Now you talk about a stick-up artist from Brooklyn who became hip-hop's answer to Lee Harvey Oswald. Maybe one of you can tell me what you're speaking to and what the story is involving that.
Oh yes, you're talking about Walter Johnson, aka Tut.
Right.
Well, Walter was largely unknown until Tupac mentioned his name in a song called "Against All Odds," and that was a diss record on his posthumous album, Don Killuminati, The 7-Day Theory, that he recorded under the pseudonym Machiavelli. That album was released shortly after Tupac was killed, and in the song, he said that Tut was the triggerman or one of the triggermen in the Quad Studios robbery, which kind of touched off the East Coast-West Coast war.
Right.
Supposedly, Tupac was put onto that information while he was in prison in upstate New York. I think even when he was in Rikers Island, just kind of there in the holding pens. He really seemed to believe that Tut was behind that. Tut already had a reputation as one of Brooklyn's most famous stick-up artists. But Tut has always maintained his innocence. He's always maintained that he had nothing to do with that. And there is something to that story, because recently, with a lot of the developments in the case of Jimmy Henchman, there's a guy named Dexter Isaac who's already a federal prisoner. He claimed that Jimmy Henchman paid him to perform the Quad Studios robbery and assault on Tupac. And he said he even has one of Tupac's gold chains to prove it, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
And that information has actually been out there for a while, but law enforcement never really picked up on it. There were quite a few inmates in the same federal penitentiary as this guy Dexter Isaacs, and they claim that he's been bragging that he did the Quad Studios job for quite a while. Right,
and Scott ended up corresponding with Tut. Talk about that, Scott.
Oh yeah, I corresponded with Tut via email. He was very, very cordial. He was very cautious, and I can understand why. Because Tupac is the most revered rap artist of all time. He's also the biggest selling rap artist of all time. I think he sold like 75 million records worldwide.
Wow.
And his fans are ravenous. They defend his legacy to the death. And they really seem, and anything that he says, a lot of times they kind of accept it, and they really seem to believe that Tut had something to do with the Quad Studio shooting, and some of them even seem to believe that he had something to do with Tupac's ultimate murder. I talked to Tut. Like I said, he came off very cautious. He came off very cordial. He even came off regretful about his legacy, not even anything related to Tupac, but just his legacy as a known stick-up artist. My personal opinion, I'm not saying that my word is law. My personal opinion, I don't think that he had anything to do with Quad Studios.
Why is that?
For me, it's gut instinct, and it's also the fact that the Dexter Isaacs thing was never properly looked into by the authorities, because I think they may have had an agenda against Tut, because he shot a police officer in a barbershop, and the police officer failed to identify himself, and because of that, Tut was acquitted of what they were trying to charge him with. So I think that, there probably was just kind of an agenda on law enforcement to not really look into that case, they probably figured, well, he's a stick-up artist anyway. He's a known bad guy in the streets. So who cares if, something else is pinned on him?
Right.
Tupac's murder is growing into one of the biggest mysteries in entertainment history. In fact, there's a movie coming out pretty soon that's in production. I think it's finished, and a lot of people are waiting for that movie to come out. And people are really fascinated by his death because there's so many unsolved questions, unanswered questions that really people are looking for answers.
Right. Now I'll ask who is the modern day desperado who died by the gun but managed to live on through hip hop music?
Oh, okay. That would be Kelvin Martin. Kelvin Martin also went by the nickname or the street name 50 Cent.
Okay.
He had that nickname long before the rapper 50 Cent picked it up and began to use it as his rapping name. Kelvin Martin, both him and Tut, they operated during the 1980s. And during the 1980s, especially in New York City, the crack trade was exploding. So you had a lot of younger hustlers in the street who were coming into some very relatively big money, and they would show this money off. They would buy gaudy jewelry, they would buy cars, they would hang out in their old neighborhoods, and they became targets for a lot of the local stick-up kids.
Right.
Because contrary to popular belief, just because you're selling drugs, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a tough guy or that you're able to defend yourself when somebody brings violence to your doorstep.
Sure.
Kelvin Martin was a very small guy. I think he weighed 120 some odd pounds.
Right.
But he was fearsome. He carried 2 long barrel revolvers. He pretty much would rob anybody that came across his path. He had been shot numerous times. He was said to have stolen big gold chains from LL Cool J and from a rapper named Rakim, Rakim is one of the most respected rappers ever, and LL, of course, is one of the biggest rap stars ever. And, that's never been really substantiated or proven. Kelvin did appear on a photo on the back of the cover of Rakim's debut album with Eric B. called Paid in Full. 50 Cent appeared in a photo on the back of that.
Right.
And he was just kind of, his name kind of rang out in the streets. I mean, a lot of local drug dealers hated him. A lot of the more prominent drug dealing crews hated him. He was one of those guys that he preyed on those kind of people.
Right.
And when the rapper 50 Cent kind of adopted his name, which is kind of funny in and of itself because 50 Cent, of course, is from Southside Queens. Kelvin is from Brooklyn. Kelvin was from Brooklyn, and there's kind of especially back in the 80s, the boroughs kind of had, a lot of the neighborhoods within the 5 boroughs kind of had rivalries with each other. So it's kind of interesting to see that, someone from Queens would take on the name of a famous outlaw from Brooklyn. But, 50 Cent took on the name, and he became more famous than Kelvin Martin ever had been, but 50 Cent has always been forthcoming about where that name came from and what it means.
Right. You can see why I recruited Scott.
Absolutely.
He's got and maybe Scott can explain a little bit about his background. He writes a very popular hip-hop blog, and personal and also one for Planet Ill. Maybe talk a little bit about your background, Scott, where you're from. It's very interesting.
Okay, yeah. Well, I got my start as on a site called Planet Ill. I still write for it. It's owned and run by a colleague of mine named O'Diesel. He also is one of probably the chief contributor to that site. He writes a lot of the articles. And then probably about in April of 2010, I branched out and I started my own blog, Scott's Introspection Section. And that blog is a little bit more specialized, a little bit more tailored to my own personal interests. Planet Ill is a little bit more broad. It covers kind of a broad hip-hop spectrum, but from a more mature perspective because, believe it or not, people don't realize it, but there's a lot of guys like me in their 30s. We've been listening to rap music for the past 20 years. It's the main music we listen to, and as we've grown and matured, our perspective on the music has changed, but a lot of the blogs and hip-hop sites out there don't reflect that kind of change. they're still geared towards the teenagers. They're still geared towards the 20-something. But Planet Ill and my blog, we kind of try to step it up a little bit. You know, we kind of address hip-hop as more or less a fact of life and not just a fad you go through when you're a teenager.
So more about the lifestyle in the background rather than the music so much.
Well, it's the music. The music is always the chief focus, but it's just, you know, we won't just cover whoever the latest star is that's appealing to the 15-year-olds. We'll still talk to the guys who. We'll still talk to Chuck D from Public Enemy, even though he's not necessarily relevant to the younger kids now.
I see.
That sort of thing.
Right. The guys that you feel are the most important guys in hip hop, from a historical point of view as well.
Yes, and we also don't limit it to, because ever since gangster rap came out, there's this assumption on the part of the mainstream that that's all that hip hop is.
Right.
And that's never been from '79 when Sugar Hill Gang came out up until now. That's never been the case, and we try to shed light on that as well.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about Scott is he has a background that gives him insight into crime. He was a corrections officer as well, so which is kind of interesting. Which I found out was kind of interesting, and maybe you could talk a little about that, Scott, and how it impacted on your view and interest in crime history and stories.
Oh, well, I became a New York State correction officer in March of 2006 is when I entered the academy. I worked at Fishkill. And then I spent most of my time at Sing Sing from about June 2006 to August 2008. I worked the graveyard shift. I worked the overnight shift from about 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. in the morning, so the inmates were mostly asleep, but you know, my career wasn't that eventful, but, you know, there were things that I did learn, things that I did find out. I more or less saw the less glamorous side of crime.
Sure.
I saw where those guys kind of end up, and a lot of it is just kind of like you begin to see. One story is in the case of I don't know if you've ever heard of him. A guy named Larry Davis.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, well, okay, long story short, Larry Davis was he's another kind of prominent street figure. He was supposedly selling drugs, and the police came to bust him one day, and he had this, amazing shootout with these cops, and he put all of them in the hospital, and, wounded them pretty badly. It was really, when you read the story, it's like a Western, like a Sergio Leone flick almost. No, this was in the Bronx. He kind of became a folk hero in the hood. He claimed that these cops, like a lot of the narcotic squads back then in the mid to late 80s, in order to make busts, they were getting black kids off the street and forcing them to sell drugs and feed them information. At the same time, he said these cops were in his pockets and they were crooked, and they realized he had a lot of information on him, so that's why they wanted him killed. Well, a couple of years ago, Larry Davis was killed at Chepsiuk. And just through the grapevine, I had heard that, he seemed larger than life on the streets, but then when you see these guys in jail, they're kind of, not that special. They tend to be kind of a-holes to their even their families don't like them. The other inmates can't stand them. Right. They're very hard to get along with. They're kind of old and broke down, kind of like, it's kind of like when in Westerns, when you see the old broke down gunfighters, and it's just kind of because the rappers never tell you that part of the story.
Sure.
Right. I think it's interesting in our book, if there is a message, crime doesn't pay. Because if you read our stories, all the characters have unhappy endings in the story, and I think that the life is glamorous, the stories are exciting, but eventually it ends in failure. And I think one of the misconceptions about criminals is that they're smart. I really don't think criminals are smart because they keep making the same mistakes again and again. And if you're a smart person, you would not do that.
Oh, I would tend to agree with Ron on that. I think a lot of them actually may be smart, but I don't think even a smart person can hold up in that lifestyle for too long, because I think it goes beyond simply being smart, in my opinion.
Right. Well, except for one character, may have broken our generalization. In the book, we talk about him. You've probably read that story about Frank Matthews.
Yes.
Which I think Scott would agree is probably our most fascinating character in the book. Because
tell us about him.
He's very timely now because Woody Bozier, famous Irish gangster from Boston, was captured, and people were all excited about that, and he was on the run since 1995. But Frank Matthews has been on. We don't know what happened. He's been on the run. Let's say he's been on the run since 1974, and if you read the story that I have that we have in the book, he disappeared off the face of the earth. And if there's an Al Capone for black gangsters, he would be hit. He was the first African American gangster to establish the international connection. He operated outside the hood, and he had operations in 21 states. And when he fled, he reportedly had something like $15 million to help him in his plight. And I ended up, in fact, I'm doing a book on him, a documentary, and I'm working on that now. But I've talked to a lot of the marshals and D agents that had tracked him. When he fled in '74, they put a $25,000 reward on him. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it was the biggest reward since John Dillinger was on the loose in 1934. And they assumed that they would catch him, because the good guys always catch their man. And they had a special unit that tracked Matthews, and they were getting sightings in more than 50 countries, believe it or not. And they checked out every lead, and they absolutely found nothing, absolutely nothing. And I've been researching the book, and it's just incredible. It's more than a gangster story; it's a mystery story. And I think anybody that's interested in a good mystery story, whether they like gangster stories, would probably find the story really fascinating. If he's still alive, he's quite he's young still. He's only 67 years old. So but there's absolutely no picture of him, no credible sighting of him, nothing. He just vanished. And the only comparison I can make maybe is like Jimmy Hoffa, when Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, but eventually they found what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, but there's no credible theories at all. And the marshals that have tracked him will admit that, because I've interviewed them, and the case is still open. And they told me that if some kind of credible lead came in, they would probably go look it up, but it's not really active. So it's it's an incredible story, and one of probably the biggest mystery in the history of organized crime.
One thing I want to say about it, one little quick thing is, Ron likens Frank Matthews to Al Capone, but in my mind, Frank Matthews is much closer to a fictional gangster, and that's Kaiser Sose from the movie The Usual Suspects.
Right.
Very good. Yeah.
If you see that movie and you see how they portray the character of Kaiser Sose, whereas it's a real guy, but they kind of play around with it. Has he done all these things they say he's done? Is this guy real? Because he does all these larger than life things, and you realize at the end of the movie, he was real, and he was right at the cops' nose the whole time. That's kind of when I think of Frank Matthews, that's what comes to mind.
Right. Well, I could tell you, Matthews has become such an incredible legend. I can tell you some stories. I don't know. I can't recall if they're in the book or not, because I've done a lot of research on him. But one of the things, Matthews evidently had a cocaine habit before he fled, and the marshals got a word that he was in Houston. This was in the late 70s. He was in Houston at a hospital there, and he was going to undergo a heart transplant. And of course, they were sort of skeptical of this, and it was given to them by an anonymous white woman that claimed she knew Matthews from back in New York. So evidently they went out to Houston, they checked it out, and couldn't find anything. I met one guy in Durham. He's from Durham, North Carolina. Claimed he showed up at a funeral dressed as a woman. one of his, I can't remember who died, but he showed up with a woman. These are some of the stories that have circulated, and some of them are really incredible, but none of them have really checked out, and there's absolutely no picture. When Boger disappeared, there was a picture of him in an ATM machine in Europe, which indicated that he was alive. But Matthews, there's been no pictures at all, nothing, absolutely nothing.
Incredible. A lot of these stories do involve drugs. Just, not to say and make any conclusion out of that, but a lot of these stories involve drugs. And I found one of the more interesting stories was the Henry Marzette Jr., the narcotics cop dealing heroin in Detroit. So maybe if you could tell us about Henry Marzette Jr.
Right. Yeah. You're talking. Go ahead.
Henry Marzette Jr. Well, I came across him. There's a very talented documentary filmmaker that I interviewed a while back. I'm trying to remember his name. Escapes me at the moment. But he did a he specializes in doing documentaries about Detroit, about the crime scene in Detroit, and one of them had a quick segment about that guy, Henry Marzette Jr. And basically Henry Marzette, he emerged at a time where Al Prophet, that's his name, Al Prophet, documentary filmmaker named Al Prophet. He's done a few documentaries about Detroit, and he mentions Henry Marzette Jr. And Henry Marzette Jr. was one of the first narcotics cops, I think, in Detroit, if not the first. The Detroit PD was trying to kind of get a line on some of the black gangsters and some of their drug business, and it's kind of hard to do that when you have only white cops on your payroll.
Sure.
They can't really penetrate those circles, and Henry Marzette did, but in Training Day fashion, he turned rogue. After a stint in prison, I think he got hooked up with some Italian mobsters, and he turned rogue. And according to legend, he grew to rule over the narcotics trade in the black sections of Detroit. There is scant information on this guy, very scant. I contacted many people, including Barry Michael Cooper, who wrote the script for the movie New Jack City. He had mentioned Henry Marzette in a story he did years and years and years ago, and there's very little information on this guy. If I'm not mistaken, I think that he has a relative that still refutes the claims made about him, that still says he was not a dirty cop, and that a lot of these allegations are false. But I mean, the folklore says otherwise.
Right.
We actually have two stories in there in the book. We have another story about Chester Campbell, who was one of the most notorious hitmans in U.S. history. Very low-keyed a guy, and so like Scott says, a lot of these stories we barely get enough information to do, a profile of them, 1,500, 2,000 words, because the information is so scant. And I think that the Chester Campbell story is an example of that. I squeezed everything I could get, going to the Detroit newspapers and trying to find, information that could make for an interesting story.
I'm a little confused on one of the stories, but it was interesting what you had written, that one of these gangsters, these prominent black gangsters, was so powerful that there was no interference from the Italian mafia in their area, and said to them, if something happens to one of my men, then there's going to be a lot of dead cops.
That's Frank Matthews.
If something happens to one of my men, I'm going to go down Mulberry Street and kill, quote, every wop.
I thought
that's actually Frank Matthews. And, that's the part of his character, his brashness, and why he's such a legend on that. Evidently, he didn't have a really good relation. Well, he actually, in those days, you really had to go to the Italians if you wanted to break into the drug trade, and Matthews was very ambitious. You know, he came from Durham, spent some time in Philadelphia, went to New York, got to start in the numbers. But he saw the opportunities. You know, as a gangster, he saw the opportunities that were opening up with the heroin trade in the late 60s, you know, during the Vietnam War and the early 70s. And he wanted to get in, but you had to go to the Italians. And the story is, which I haven't been able to verify yet in my research, that he went to the Italians and they turned him down for whatever reason. And he went to a Cuban drug dealer named Rolando Gonzalez. And Gonzalez was being indicted for heroin trafficking, but he fled to Venezuela, and evidently Gonzalez gave him his start by selling him some of his heroin before he fled, and then Gonzalez became his big contact in Venezuela, and that's how he became an international drug trade. So when I say he's the first international African American international to establish a connection, actually. The book I did on Sergeant Smack, Ike Atkinson was there at the same time, but I'm talking about within the United States, outside the United States. Ike was in Thailand when he set up his ring.
Right. If I could chime in on that just for 1 second, not to cut Ron off. The funny thing about that particular instance that you're talking about, when he openly challenges the Italian mafia in that way. If you look at a lot of the old blaxploitation films from the 70s, like Superfly, like Black Caesar, right. Even some of the more current black movies like New Jack City, there is, at Sugar Hill, there is a kind of a running theme about a prominent black gangster or a prominent black crew that starts out underneath the wing of the Italian mafia and then at some point outgrows that relationship or wants to kind of take the throne for themselves. And that's kind of in the 70s. Frank Matthews was kind of one of the first, if not the first, to kind of establish that trend. I think because Frank Matthews was originally from North Carolina, unlike a lot of the other black gangsters that had been established in New York for many, many years, who had been accustomed to being underneath the rule of the Italian mob, I don't think Frank Matthews really took to that too well. He had more of a rebellious spirit.
Right. I think that's very true about Frank. And like a lot of gangsters, he came from North Carolina. There were a lot of famous gangsters that came from the South and went north.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. That I had no idea, but to see so many gangsters from, like you say, South Carolina, North Carolina.
Right, well, I'll give you an example, Dan. You got Buffy Johnson. He was born in Charleston.
Yeah.
You got Frank Matthews. He was from Durham, and of course the Frank Lucas, the famous American gangster, was from North Carolina as well. And I can name a lot of other gangsters that aren't in the book, but came from the north. It was like they were part of the migration. The African American migration north, looking for a better life, better jobs. And of course, gangsters went north too. Starting in the before World War I, it began, and they went north looking for opportunities. And of course, their opportunity was on the other side of the law, right?
Yeah, it was interesting too. Is that I'm obviously you're the true crime expert and written quite a few books, but I think people have a general impression that the organized crime is mostly white Americans and Italian in heritage, but also some other nationalities obviously were involved in crews, maybe weren't initiated into mafia per se, but you really don't read much in these mafia books about the uncomfortable or comfortable or relationship with black gangsters whatsoever. So it's interesting in your books, and especially in the Straight from the Hood, to hear some of these stories. And was another interesting story, again, involving mobster, was you talk about the indeed crazy Joe Gallo and his alliance with black gangsters. So maybe if you could tell us about Crazy Joe Gallo.
Oh, Crazy Joe Gallo was crazy. You ask any detective that investigated him, and he was a mobster that would kill anybody if he was slighted, and he had a short temper. He had a short fuse. He was tough. He was wiry, fair-haired, but he was also very, very smart and very educated. And he read all kinds of great books, of literature and philosophy and all that. And he struck up a relationship with Nicky Barnes, who became known as Mr. Untouchable. And he was a prominent African-American gangster in the 70s, but this happened in the 60s. And Joe Gallo took him under his wing. He was serving a long sentence in jail, and he met Nicky Barnes, and they struck up a long friendship, and they would have discussions, to pass the time. And Gallo knew a lot about the mob, and also about the gangster life, and how to operate a drug trafficking enterprise. And of course, Nicky Barnes, even though he was in jail, was a true gangster. He was going to aspire to the gangster life after he's got out. So they talked about this, and Nicky Barnes, who for fun would read legal tombs in prison. This is the kind of guy he was. He was very brainy as well. And so they got along, and they had this wild idea about establishing some kind of super syndicate, of African American drug dealers. And Gallo, Nicky Barnes would sort of run it, and Gallo would be the guy behind the scenes doing all that. And what happened was that Gallo initiated a mob war, famous mob war, and against Joe Profaci, who was a really powerful gangster. And Gallo even kidnapped several members of Profaci's family, demanding more money, from his drug trafficking enterprise. And so this led to a war, and he was eventually killed in a restaurant. But Nicky Barnes really didn't need him because this is when the drug trade was opening up. The Italians are losing their grip. If you've seen the movie French Connection,
right,
with Gene Hackman, that talks about the demise of the French Connection, which is kind of a misnomer because it was actually run by the Italians. It was a French Connection because the heroin was processed in Marseille.
Sure.
And from there, it was shipped through Montreal or to New York. And but with the breakup of the French Connection, it opened up opportunities for other ethnic groups. And the Italians lost their mob, and Nicky Barnes was there at this time, and it allowed him to use his contacts. He was a very diplomatic type of person. He knew how to operate very smooth, and he did establish a relationship with the Italian mafia, but he was able to develop his career. So this story, is sort of a vignette taken from gangster history, and I thought it was interesting that you had these two really contrasting personalities that developed this relationship. And of course, Barnes went on to become one of the biggest informants in U.S. history. He spent about 30 years in prison, and he got out because he became an informant, and they eventually let him out, and he's still in the Federal Witness Protection Program.
Let me ask this question, and the mafioso had a general rule that was broken by members of the mob, but that was that they didn't want to be involved in any drugs. Is the alliance? Pardon me?
That's the biggest myth.
Sure.
In mafia history. I mean, they were dealing in drugs all the way back, to the 20s, and it's part of the hypocrisy that existed, with the mafia, where they were like good gangsters. They didn't get their hands, dirtied by getting involved in the drug trade, but they were, a lot of them were doing it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's what got led to John Gotti becoming such a big head, because he was secretly dealing in drugs, and he was afraid that Paul Castellano, who was the godfather of the Gambinos at that time, would find out, and that would be the end of him. So he did a hit on Castellano. So this was going on for a long time, and you see this myth perpetrated in Hollywood films and in common legend.
What I was asking is that, of course, that is a big myth, and obviously they dealt drugs. But was the relationship that they cultivated with black organized crime? Was it a result of them realizing that they would have a difficult time going into these neighborhoods that were predominantly black, and that they knew that these guys were not hesitant to deal drugs? It seems that there never was any code among black gangsters not to deal drugs. So, am I getting this wrong, or is there something to that?
Well, I think that's a good point. I don't know. I think that's a good point because, and Scott can address this too. But with the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, black communities began to take, black communities began to take over their own communities, away and become more self-reliant. And I think this sort of happened too in the criminal aspect too, as well. The white mafia lost their power in communities. I think you see that in Harlem, especially, and this led to the rise of the black gangster.
Well, I also think another side to that is I also think that especially heroin was largely something that like the Italian mafia would kind of deal in the black communities. It was they would get it, they would wholesale it, and they would sell it to blacks to sell to other blacks. Mm-hmm. And I think that what happened was I don't think anybody really counted on like as Ron said, the French connection kind of crumbling and the Italians kind of losing their grip, because once that happened, I think that just opened the door for like Ike Atkinson and Frank Matthews and a lot of other factors that allowed black gangsters to really capitalize on the drug trade in a way that they hadn't before, because once the mafia was out of the way, black gangsters kind of they were able to get direct connections to whoever, like in the 80s you had black gangsters that dealt directly who were selling cocaine and who dealt directly with the Colombian cartels. So you had that kind of. I don't think it was something that was really intended to happen. I don't think that a Nicky Barnes or Frank Matthews or even going into modern day a Freeway Ricky Ross was supposed to ever exist. I think it was just kind of a side effect.
But my point is, and I try to do this in my books, is to give a lot of background, is you can't divorce gangster history from the societal forces that are in play at the time.
Sure.
And there was a big change, and I think, Matthew's attitude, we talk about him, and his attitude, his arrogance, partially reflects that. And, a lot of these people, for example, Matthews was a very big admirer of Malcolm X. And, his message of black self-reliance and all that. And, these criminals, were aware of what's going on around them. And I think that they absorbed a lot of it. And I think that's one of the, so my point is you can't really, treat criminal history as something separate from society. It's a part of the society and the various forces that work at a particular moment in time.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about crack too, not to stereotype or anything, but you could see that even the penalties for the powdered version of cocaine reflected socioeconomic situation. White people, people with more economic means, were not not reverting to crack, but were doing the powder and maybe even freebasing. But certainly crack seems to be the drug that was created for the average person that didn't have a lot of money, and so it did reflect sort of a classism of sorts, the difference between people and their socioeconomic situation.
Well, that's what's interesting about that phenomenon, and something that I've always personally found funny, is it seems that the powers that be they think that they can always corral these things or control them. And one thing I've noticed, and of course I don't have the extensive knowledge that Ron has on the history of crime and the drug trade, but one thing I've noticed with the drug trade is it's very volatile and unpredictable by nature. Nobody can have control of it for very long. It passes through many different hands, and when as I said before, the rise of the black gangster, I don't think was something that was ever really intended to happen. The Italian mob probably figured they would maintain control of the drug trade forever.
Mm-hmm.
Various factors such as the Vietnam War, such as the civil rights movement, such as the FBI cracking down on them, forcing more of them to turn snitch, brought it into that reign and opened the door for others to step in.
Right. And unlike maybe some people's perceptions, these black guys were very savvy, very powerful, very determined, connected, and like you say, it was maybe been a surprise to many, many people, but certainly they established themselves very well in their own communities and went on to fame and infamy, really.
Right. I think that started a trend, because one of the most noticeable characteristic of the drug trade today is diversity. I mean, you've got all kinds of ethnic groups, everything from Chinese to the Vietnamese to the Dominicans, to the African Americans, the Jamaicans. You could go on and on. Mexicans, all play a powerful role in the drug trade. Drug trade today is as big as it's ever been.
Sure.
Even given all the money that's been spent trying to stamp out the illegal drug trade.
Sure, certainly. Now we've only got a few minutes here, so I want to just make sure that everybody knows some of the programs, some of the blog sites, and where we can get this book. Maybe, Scott, you can talk about, just mention again the blog site that you have and where we can maybe read some of your work. And then after that, maybe Ron can tell us about a couple of his books and where is the best place to get a copy of Straight from the Hood.
Okay, well, my personal blog site is Scott's Introspection Section. That's kind of a long name, but the domain name is relatively short. The domain name is www.scottsmindfield.com. That's SCOTTSMINDFIELD. I also write for planetill.com. That's www.planetill.com. And I'm a frequent contributor with Don Diva magazine.
Right on.
Right.
Is this your first book, Scott? Sorry. Is this your first book published?
Yes, it is my first book. Yeah, this Straight from the Hood is my first time as a published author.
Oh, great work. Okay, go ahead, Ron. Sorry.
Right. I'll just say that as far as the book is concerned, Straight from the Hood, True and Amazing Gangster Tales, they can go, probably the best thing to do is go to strategicmediabooks.com website, www.strategic, STRAGIC, Strategic Media Books, and there's a summer sale going on, so you could probably get it cheaper than Amazon. And of course, the book's sold in Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all that. And so, again, www.strategicmediabooks.com.
Is there an e-book version available as well?
Yes, the e-book version, they could get it from the website or Amazon, and yes, the e-book version is available. And
you're also a co-host of a great show, Ron.
Excuse me, Dan. I misspoke on that. E-book is coming soon. We came out with the print book first, but it'll be coming out soon. But by going to the website, you can keep abreast of development.
And also, I just wanted you to mention too, you're on a great crime show called Crime Beat with Will Herb. Maybe tell us just a little bit about that. Mention that for us as well.
Well, and one of our best guests was Dan Supansky.
Oh, sure.
We appreciate that. Yes, Crime Beat on the Artist First Worldwide Radio Network. Go to www.artistfirst.com. Crime Beat. Click on the Crime Beat. Tomorrow we're on Thursdays at 8 p.m. We've got one of the worldwide renowned experts on serial killers, Dr. Michael Stone, who's going to be talking about his research, and so, he's interviewed a lot of the big name serial killers. So that should be a real fascinating show.
Absolutely, yeah, great program, Ron, and again,
Thank
another
you.
great book. And I wanted to thank both of you gentlemen for coming on to the program. You guys are born storytellers. I wanted to tell people they've been listening to the program. And we listened, the book featured is Straight from the Hood, Amazing But True Gangsters Tales, Ron Chepsiuk and Scott Wilson. Again, thank you very much, gentlemen, for a great interview and a great book. And I wish you the best with this project. And I'm sure I'll be hearing from both of you again real soon with another incredible and interesting and unknown. A lot of this stuff just comes from such a different perspective, and I think the audience is really going to appreciate that, and of course the readers will as well. Just something totally different from what you might read and what you see. So great, interesting stories are not so well known, and but fascinating tales. So
thank you, Dan. We appreciate being on the show.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
And
thank you.
You guys have a great evening. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to the program, True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about it. Good night.
Dan?
Yes?
You there?
Yeah, we got to go. Good night.
Yeah, Dan?